Welcome everybody to L2R. I'm Kinaesthesia, and today I'll be going over our strategy for Cho'gall on the heroic difficulty. Cho'gall is the final heroic boss you'll defeat before unlocking Sinestra. He's no pushover, but if your raid can defeat this boss, you'll be ready for anything. The Cho'gall encounter is one of the most difficult in this tier of raiding. It will put your DPS, healing, and execution to the test. Although Cho'gall is actually a 3-phase encounter, Phase 1 is a minor part of the fight and does not significantly impact the encounter. We will be covering this as a 2-phase fight, combining 1 and 2 into a single phase. Cho'gall has around 175 million HP. The adherent adds he spawns throughout the fight have 3.3 million HP each. He'll also spawn fire and shadow elementals that have 747,000 HP each. In Phase 2, he can summon darkened creations with 250,000 HP each, and spiked tentacles with around 4.1 million HP. You'll want to bring 2 tanks, 5 to 7 healers depending on your raid's DPS, and a balanced DPS makeup consisting of good interrupts and classes that can AoE stun or break the mind controls throughout the encounter. At the beginning of the fight, each member of the raid will have a UI element or graphic added to their screen that tracks their corruption level. During the encounter, the abilities Cho'gall and his adds use will cause stacks of corrupted blood. Raid members will be afflicted with varying debuffs depending on how high their corrupted blood is. This mechanic is similar to Madness from the Yogg-Saron encounter and should be approached the same way. Avoid gaining corrupted blood at all costs. Here are the debilitations raid members will gain as their debuff grows. At level 1, 25%, players will gain Corruption Accelerated. This will cause them to gain 2 stacks of corrupted blood every second for 1 minute. It is magic dispellable and should be removed immediately. At level 2, 50%, players will be afflicted with Corruption Sickness. This will cause them to periodically vomit and cause high shadow damage to all friendly players in a 5-yard cone in front of them. The vomit will also cause corrupted blood. Players must be sure to face away from other raid members before doing this. At level 3, 75%, players will gain Corruption Malformation. A tentacle will grow out of the player's back and shoot shadow bolts at nearby raid members. At level 4, 100%, players are afflicted with Corruption Absolute. They will receive 100% less healing, but do 100% more damage. Spells will also be instant casts. Now that we've covered the main mechanic of the fight, let's go over Cho'gall's abilities. Throughout Phase 1 of the fight, Cho'gall will use Conversion. This causes him to mind control 3 random players. These players will not heal or damage anybody. Instead, they will begin to worship Cho'gall, giving him a stacking buff called Twisted Devotion. This buff lasts 1 minute and will increase all damage the boss does. Cho'gall will alternate between Flame's orders and Shadow's orders. This is a buff gained by consuming the fire and shadow elementals he spawned during Phase 1. The buff will increase in stacks depending on the health of the elemental when consumed. Flame's orders will increase his melee damage and spawn fire patches around the room. Shadow's orders will cause his melee attacks to proc a damaging AoE that hits all players. He will occasionally use Fury of Cho'gall to deal high shadow and physical damage to his current aggro target. This will also increase their physical and shadow damage taken for 45 seconds. During Phase 1, the boss will use Summon Corrupting Adherent to spawn 2 Corrupting Adherent adds. These come with a few abilities of their own. One of the Corrupting Adherent's main abilities is Depravity. This deals high shadow damage to all players and causes corruption. This 1.5 second cast must be interrupted each time. They will also cast Corrupting Crash. These are similar to Shadow Crash from the Vazax encounter. A large purple missile will float through the air and players must avoid standing in the crash zone. This will deal high shadow damage and build corruption. Adherents will also use Sprayed Corruption, a frontal cone ability dealing moderate shadow damage and building corruption. When they are killed, adherents will spawn Spilled Blood of the Old Gods. These pools of black blood will cause mild shadow damage to anybody standing in them and build corruption. A short while after the adds spawn, Cho'gall will cast Fester Blood. This spell causes the blood of the corrupting adherents to fester. If they are still alive, they will begin to channel a powerful AoE that hits all players and causes corruption. If they are dead, multiple adds, Blood of the Old Gods, will spawn from their spilled blood pools. These adds melee for a mild amount, but grant corruption with each hit. Phase 2 will begin when the boss reaches 25% health. In Phase 2, Cho'gall will retain his Fury of Cho'gall ability. He will begin to pulse a mild ticking AoE called Corruption of the Old God. Throughout the phase, the boss will spawn Darkened Creations. These adds have minimal HP, but will use Debilitating Beam, an ability that reduces the target's healing and damage and deals mild shadow damage. Cho'gall will also spawn Spiked Tentacles. These adds will knock back all nearby players upon spawning and will melee players throughout the phase. Now that all of the abilities have been covered, let's go over how to defeat this two-headed ogre. Positioning in Phase 1 is simple but very important. Pull Cho'gall to just in front of his throne and face him toward it. The raid will stack in melee range directly behind the boss. This allows for healing and mind control interrupts to be much faster. Each time Cho'gall uses conversion, have multiple AoE interrupts ready to break people out. It is essential to break the mind controls immediately. We use Psychic Scream, Dragon's Breath, and Solar Beam, but there are many abilities that will work for this. In order to ease the DPS check of this encounter, the Fire and Shadow elementals are completely ignored. This means that Flame and Shadow's orders will always have a 9 or 10 stack. Use cooldowns to make these more manageable. Use Aura Mastery, Power Word Barrier, or Divine Guardian for each Shadow's orders, and use tank cooldowns for each Fire's orders. Whenever a tank is hit by the Fury of Cho'gall debuff, the other tank must taunt the boss off of them. The corrupting adherents should be picked up by the off tank and pulled behind the raid. Once the first corrupting crash goes out, the raid positioning will adjust. Because corrupting crash prefers to target players at range from the adherent, 5 players will be assigned to stand off to the side and DPS the adherent while the rest of the range and healers stack on top of the adherents. Melee will stay on the boss during this. Assign players to interrupt each adherent so that depravity is not cast on the raid. Backup interrupt should also be assigned in case the first player is mind controlled. The adherents should be DPS down evenly so they can eventually die around the same time. When they are getting close to death, have the tank pull them back away from the raid. When they die, they will spill their blood and create corrupted blood pools. All players should avoid standing in this, but it will become more difficult for the tank since all adherents must die in the same spot. There are 2 general ways to handle this. The first is for the tank to heroic leap over the previous blood pools, so each new ad runs through it to die. Once the ad is dead, the tank is free to run around the pool back to Cho'gall. Another way still involves the tank leaping over the pool, but instead of running back around to Cho'gall, the tank will then be pulled back over the blood pools with a priest's leap of faith. This can also grant more control over ad placement by forcing the ads to walk back across the same pool. Overall, it will take some practice to perfect, but the idea is that each ad dies in a neat stack on top of the same blood pool. Shortly after each ad dies, multiple Blood of the Old Gods will spawn out of the pools. These should be slowed using a Hunter Trap and AoE down by ranged DPS. If they begin to reach the raid, use a knockback to keep them at bay. Players must not allow the small ads to melee them, or they will gain a high stack of corruption. The safest thing to do if an ad is reaching you is run through Cho'gall to the other side. Remember to run back once it's safe, however, in anticipation of the next mind control. Phase 1 is all about high DPS and control. It will seem chaotic because so much is going on, but staying in control of it all will keep the phase manageable. When Cho'gall reaches 25%, Phase 2 will begin. In Phase 2, the tank should pull Cho'gall back up to the throne. We spread the raid out in small groups. The healers will stand in the middle to keep range on all players, while the ranged DPS will spread out on both sides of the healers. The number 1 priority in Phase 2 is killing the Darkened Creations. They will reduce the effectiveness of the raid and should be handled immediately each time they spawn. The bigger spiked tentacles will be ignored. These add to the softened rage of the fight by adding raid damage and potentially killing off players. This phase will not be sustainable long and is a DPS race to the end. Make sure to have multiple dispellers for this phase, as many players will start to gain Corruption Accelerated. Players who progress to Corruption Sickness must remember not to face other players as they vomit. This will decrease the sustainability of this phase and possibly cause your raid to wipe. It's best to use Tranquilities and Divine Hymns during this phase to ease the healing constraints of the encounter and sustain the phase. Remember to stay calm and controlled during phase 1 and use everything you can to burn through phase 2. This fight is not easy by any means, so do not become discouraged when your raid wipes repeatedly. Focus on the tips we've provided and you'll soon unlock Sinestra. Thanks for checking us out here at L2R. We hope this guide was helpful.
I wasn't feeling so good. I just didn't feel like playing anymore. So I went home and I got all comfy and cozy and all scrunched up in front of my phonograph.